Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Wow. The word of the day, W-O-W, wow. It seems like just yesterday was a month ago, and it seems like so many things are going to happen before tomorrow. And on this podcast, we want to talk about leadership. Perhaps never in our lifetimes has leadership been so important. In fact, so critical. So we need to talk about it. But there's so many things happening, seemingly all at once. So many big events. We're going to take a little bit of time today to look back in hopes as using that as a vehicle to look forward. Now, we're not going to look back too far, although it might seem like a long time ago. We're going to look back to the Munich Security Conference, now just a little over a week ago. We're going to talk about an article by Frederick Kempe. He's with the Atlantic Council, highly respected international organization. I've been to their events. I've participated with the Eurasian Center at the Atlantic Council. It is an exemplary organization. Well, to look back, to begin. At the Munich Security Conference, Frederick Kempe had an opportunity to speak with the president of Finland, President Alexander Stubb. And he covered a lot of ground, but in a short amount of time. And I think it is a good prescription for going forward. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the conversation that the Finnish President and Frederick Kempe had at the Munich Security Conference, because I think it's going to set a stage for so many other events that have been occurring. Let's begin. Well, the Finnish president focused on a long game. He thought that was really important, that we all needed to do that. Not just Finland, not just Europe, but all parties going forward. Why? Well, because of what was said by the United States at the Munich Security Conference. In particular, the U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance, really gave out a broadside, an attack on European democracy and his de facto endorsement of Germany's furthest right party, known as the AfD, ahead of their elections. Now, we are looking back, and so now we know in the current that the AfD party did not prevail. They got more votes than before, which was concerning. It is concerning, but they will not be the ruling party. They will not be part of Germany's government going forward. Well, here's what the Finnish president said, reflecting upon those prospective events and now events that we know about. And he said the following with Frederick Kempe, I'm quoting, "We rationalize the past, we over-dramatize the present, and underestimate the future." That was his thinking. I think it's something we should all stop and think about. How, looking forward, we could responsibly talk about a negotiated peace between Russia and Ukraine, as an example. He talks about envisioning a process in 3 distinct stages. Let me go through them here quickly. First, the Finnish president says there should be a period of pre-negotiations. This would focus on strengthening Ukraine's position. A ceasefire then would follow that establishes a line of contact, confidence-building measures, important, security arrangements. And this is what the U.S. president and vice president have been incredibly reluctant and frankly have said no to. Why would a person who has regularly and routinely, now talking about the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, who has violated agreements repeatedly, why would one not want security arrangements? And as the Finnish president is saying, these would be critical and confidence building. Because while we may want to trust, as the former President Ronald Reagan has attributed, we need to verify. Trust, but verify. And those security arrangements would allow for that verification. Because then, and only then, could peace negotiations take place. That peace, that key word, that critical word, which means that not only would the war end, but we would also be ensuring that Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian independence could happen. And with that, there could be integration of Ukraine into other Western institutions. And obviously the two that have been talked about a lot are the European Union, the EU, and, of course, NATO. Now again, President Trump, who has been quite negative on the idea of even security arrangements during a ceasefire, but has been adamantly negative on Ukraine's possibility of becoming a NATO member. Wow. So what's happened here is the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, sort of step-by-step thinking about the future, is just overwhelmed by the inescapable dramas of the present. These flurry of events that Trump and his team, this group called DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, puts out daily. It's like a deluge, often described as a fire hose. So these developments underscore what Trump is doing, what he's all about. And perhaps he broadcasted clearly when he was running. And this is just the reality. But for people around the world, they had hoped. They had, on some level, believed that that was rhetoric, that that was campaign talk. But in fact, it has turned out to be quite real and quite present in our daily lives, which has led to a bunch of discord between the U.S. and the European nations, all with this backdrop of Ukraine. So what's that convincing path going forward look like? And how could it occur? Well, language for sure has to change. Substance certainly has to change. But can the voice change? And with that, I think there's a real challenge, a real difficulty. So let's talk about the past and again use that as a prologue, hopefully, for the future. This drama began with meetings of the United States and Russia in Saudi Arabia. aimed at ending the war and repairing the relationship between the two countries. It included then, subsequently, a gathering of European officials in Paris who were excluded from Riyadh. Remember, we talked about this in a previous podcast. You need to have stakeholders present. Not only was Ukraine not present, but the Europeans were not present either in Riyadh. So, what happens? Well, you wind up in this, I'll say this nicely, spat between the U.S. president, our European partners, allies, and certainly last Friday with the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. Most people are aware that Zelensky came in hopes of thanking Americans once again, as he has done many times, and signing a minerals deal. Now think about this. It's a little bit like The Sopranos. Those of you familiar with a TV show. I'll help you, but you got to do something for me. So it's almost gangster-like, soprano-like. President Trump wanted fealty from the Ukrainian president. He wanted him to understand how grateful he should be to Trump and how he should do this mineral deal, rare earth minerals, because it was necessary to get to a peace deal. Now that sort of stretches a lot of imaginations, but frankly, it's a soprano kind of deal. You pay me enough, I'll help you. If not, you're on your own. It could be funny, but it's not. It's real. In a Truth Social post, Trump has echoed Kremlin propaganda in branding the freely elected Ukrainian president as a dictator without elections. That's a quote. And asserting that, quote, Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Well, those are just completely inappropriate. The president of Ukraine then, Zelensky, then said that Trump is operating in a, quote, disinformation space. Well, he certainly is. That may not have been helpful, though. Okay, with all that's unfolding, China then becomes an actor. China then is now considering deploying its soldiers in a peacekeeping role as part of this ceasefire notion between Russia and Ukraine. In a sense, stepping in to this sort of vacuum that the U.S. and many European leaders appear unwilling to fill. And this outcome, of course, would grant China an unprecedented role in Europe. Of course, now looking forward, we know that France and the UK have both indicated a willingness to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, effectively a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, demilitarized zone. So, back to the president of Finland. He says that we're confronting an inflection point, his quote, of historic dimensions. And what he goes on to say is that we have to get this right. We have to really and truly get this right. Well, let me go to one other spot, because there's just so many things going on. and going on all at once and having huge import into so many things, we can't forget that just a few weeks ago, Davos, the World Economic Forum, back in January, seems like forever ago. But Jake Sullivan, who at that point in time was the National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, he took that opportunity to try to describe what's really going on currently, sort of this dawning of a new era. He called it strategic competition in an age of interdependence. Others called it an age of unpeace. Others, an age of disorder. Whatever we call it, we are in a new world. And it is historic, this moment. With this war in Europe, conflicts in the Middle East, tensions with China, all kinds of things going on about this new artificial intelligence, other disruptive technologies. Well, what happened? Trump is the president of the United States. He is. He is the commander-in-chief. He's been described as impatient. He's not a particular student of history, but he wants to shape the future as he wants it to be. So, now looking forward, getting sort of back on track. All of that is context and contextual framework, important because so many things and so many substantive things are going on. We have to say, so how do we frame this negotiation if, big word, if it goes forward? Well, again, back to the Finnish president, who I think lays out these 3 points, and that's really the mission here today, to say, what should we all be on the same page about? Whether you're President Trump, President Zelensky, President Putin, European leaders, NATO leaders. Here we go. This is President Stubb of Finland. First, there is no world in which a weaker, more fragmented transatlantic community preoccupied with infighting is in the interest of either the United States or Europe. No relationship is more foundational to shaping the global future. So these are huge. You go into a negotiation, you really have to have in your head, in your heart, in your gut, this very clear notion that there is no world in which a weaker, more fragmented transatlantic community preoccupied with infighting is in the interest of either the United States or Europe. Okay, think about that, President Trump. Think about that, other world leaders. Here is point 2. Point 2 from President Stubb. There is no world in which a slow-growing, over-regulated, insufficiently innovative Europe, unable to sufficiently defend itself from a revanchist Russia, is in either European or U.S. interests. Europeans refer to the Trump administration's attacks as a wake-up call on all of these fronts. But the alarm can only ring so many times before Europe pays the price of irrelevance for failing to respond. So another just huge foundational building block for discussions going forward. There is no world in which a slow-growing, over-regulated, insufficiently innovative Europe, unable to sufficiently defend itself from a revanchist Russia, is in either European or U.S. interests. Think about that. Okay. Number 3. There is no world in which inviting China into a peacekeeping role in Ukraine is prudent. China's potential willingness to step into such a role should be a wake-up call to Trump and European leaders to settle their dispute quickly. Chinese involvement in maintaining peace in Ukraine would be like giving the henhouse to a fox, as without Beijing's support, Putin would have been unable to sustain his murderous war. So again, third point, there is no world in which inviting China into a peacekeeping role in Ukraine is prudent. Okay. On the previous podcast, I talked about something that, frankly, Trump failed at, and that is this notion in negotiations that you never have that second chance to make a first impression. He made a poor first impression. Frankly, horrific first impression. But what about the path forward, prospectively, if and when talks do evolve, when all these world events, which seem to be happening constantly and significantly around us, do bring the parties to a negotiation? With that, folks, these 3 points, that we have to understand that there is no world in which a weaker, more fragmented transatlantic community preoccupied with infighting, that's something for every party to hear, is in the interest of either the United States or Europe. Second, that there's no world in which a slow-growing, over-regulated, and insufficiently innovative Europe could defend itself from a revanchist Russia that is in either European or U.S. interests. Europe needs to hear that loud and clear. And third, that there is no world in which China can take in a role of peacekeeping. As the Finnish president says, this is like giving the henhouse to a fox. Okay, so we talked in a previous podcast about perhaps not making that first impression well, in fact, making it poorly. Well, now what happens as events continue to advance? And we hope that they do. These 3 points, I think, are critical. We must be aware as leaders to appreciate the value of each of them and to integrate them into our conduct, our discussions, and that which we negotiate for a lasting and sustainable peace. Okay, a little more on negotiation. I think it's important. I appreciate you listening. Think about these things. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.